Faith has always been powerful. For centuries, it comforted the grieving, guided the lost, and gave meaning to suffering. But in the modern age, something changed. Television entered the church. The pulpit gained a spotlight, and belief, once sacred, became something that could be marketed. This is not a documentary about faith itself. Millions find real hope in religion, and that deserves respect. This documentary is about what happens when faith becomes a product, when prayer becomes a transaction, when miracles come with price tags, when God's name is used not to heal souls, but to build empires. Tonight, we examine 10 of the most influential preachers of the modern era, men and women whose ministries reached millions, raised billions, and in many cases crossed an invisible line, not to mock, not to insult belief, but to ask a necessary question: where does devotion end and exploitation begin? This series is especially for those who have lived long enough to remember when faith felt quieter, humbler, less commercial. You've seen the evolution, you've watched it unfold, and perhaps you've asked these same questions yourself. Chapter 1, Peter Popoff. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, American religion entered a new era. Faith, once practiced quietly in local churches, moved onto television screens across the country. For many older Americans, this was not entertainment, it was companionship. Late-night broadcasts filled lonely living rooms, sermons replaced silence, and voices on the screen felt personal, almost intimate. It was in this environment that a young televangelist named Peter Popoff rose to national attention. Popoff did not present himself as an ordinary preacher. He claimed something far more extraordinary. During crowded revival meetings broadcast on television, he would suddenly stop speaking, point into the audience, and announce that God was revealing specific information to him in real time. He called out names. He named illnesses. He described addresses, family problems, and financial struggles. To viewers watching from home, many of them elderly, sick, or financially strained, it appeared miraculous. This was not symbolic preaching. This looked like direct communication from heaven. Popoff's confidence played a critical role in his success. He spoke with certainty, never hesitation. In a generation raised to respect religious authority, doubt felt dangerous. Questioning him felt like questioning God. His message was simple and emotionally powerful. God knew your pain. God wanted to help you, and God was acting through him. The promise was irresistible to people who had lived long enough to experience illness, loss, and disappointment, and who still wanted to believe that relief was possible. As his ministry grew, Popoff's broadcasts followed a carefully crafted pattern. First came suffering, testimonies of people struggling with disease, debt, or despair. Then came revelation, Popoff announcing private details he claimed only God could know. Then came the miracle, someone rising from a wheelchair, claiming healing, or declaring a financial breakthrough. And finally came the invitation. Viewers were urged to participate by writing in, sending prayer requests, and making donations. These donations were not framed as charity. They were framed as acts of faith. Popoff taught what later became widely known as prosperity theology, the idea that God rewards faith with material blessings. According to this belief, giving money was not loss, but investment. Donations were described as seeds. Plant the seed, and God would respond with healing, wealth, or relief from hardship. For people living on fixed incomes, retirees, widows, the disabled, this teaching was especially dangerous. It reframed poverty and illness not as realities of life, but as spiritual failures. If the miracle didn't come, the problem was never the preacher. It was the believer's faith. What made Popoff unique among many televangelists of the time was his claim of supernatural knowledge. He insisted that God was speaking directly into his ear during services, and in a sense, that claim turned out to be true, just not in the way audiences believed. Behind the scenes, attendees were asked to fill out prayer cards before the service. These cards included personal information, names, addresses, medical conditions, personal struggles. Instead of being discarded, they were organized and relayed backstage. In 1986, investigator and magician James Randi exposed what was really happening. Popoff was wearing a concealed radio earpiece. His wife, seated backstage, read details from the prayer cards and transmitted them to him live during the service. When Popoff called out a name, it was not divine revelation. It was information received seconds earlier. When he announced an illness, it was not prophecy. It was preparation. Audio recordings captured these transmissions clearly, leaving no room for doubt. When the recordings were made public, the reaction was explosive. National media covered the story. Religious broadcasters distanced themselves. Popoff's reputation collapsed almost overnight. For many believers, especially older viewers who had trusted him deeply, the revelation was devastating. This was not a minor exaggeration or theological disagreement. It was deliberate deception. People who had sent money they couldn't afford to lose, who had delayed medical treatment, or who had blamed themselves for unanswered prayers were left carrying the emotional weight of betrayal. The true damage was not financial alone. It was psychological. Many followers felt ashamed for believing. Others questioned their own judgment. Some lost trust not only in Popoff, but in religion itself. And yet, Popoff himself bore little of that burden. His theology ensured that failure always belonged to the believer. If the miracle didn't come, it meant the seed wasn't strong enough, the faith wasn't deep enough, or obedience wasn't complete. After the scandal, Popoff declared bankruptcy. His ministry appeared finished. To many observers, it seemed impossible that he could ever recover from such a public exposure. But faith, once turned into a brand, does not disappear easily. Years later, Popoff quietly returned. This time, his message shifted slightly. The emphasis moved from physical healing to financial miracles. He promised debt cancellation, prosperity, and deliverance through symbolic items like miracle water. The language changed, but the structure remained the same. Obedience still meant giving. Blessing was still conditional. Once again, his primary audience was older Americans, people seeking stability, relief, and hope after decades of struggle. The same emotional vulnerabilities that had fueled his original rise were still present. And despite his past exposure, many viewers either did not know the history or were willing to believe that God had given him another chance. Peter Popoff matters in this story not because he was the most successful televangelist, but because he was the prototype. He demonstrated how religious authority, emotional vulnerability, and mass media could be combined into a powerful system of influence. He showed that exposure alone does not dismantle a business model built on hope and desperation. Others would learn from his mistakes. They would refine the presentation, soften the language, and avoid the most obvious deceptions. But the underlying idea that faith could be packaged, marketed, and sold remained. This chapter is not written to mock belief or shame those who trusted. It is written to understand how easily faith can be manipulated when certainty replaces humility and money becomes a measure of devotion. When someone claims to speak for God, promises miracles, and ties those promises to payment, the cost is rarely carried by the preacher. It is carried by the believer. And as this documentary continues, the question raised by Peter Popoff will follow every story that comes next. How many times can faith be sold as a product before something sacred is lost forever? Chapter 2. Joyce Meyer. As religious broadcasting matured after the scandals of the 1980s, a new kind of preacher began to emerge. The loud theatrics softened, the miracle claims became subtler, the language shifted from spectacle to self-improvement. And in that transition, few figures proved more influential than Joyce Meyer. Joyce Meyer did not rise as a traditional televangelist shouting about instant miracles. Her appeal was quieter, more conversational, and deeply personal. She spoke less about healing crusades and more about everyday struggles, negative thoughts, emotional wounds, insecurity, anxiety, and self-doubt. For many older viewers, especially women, her message felt relatable in a way earlier televangelists never had. She spoke like someone who understood pain not as a theological concept, but as lived experience. Meyer frequently shared her own past, describing childhood abuse, emotional trauma, and years of inner turmoil. This vulnerability built trust. Viewers didn't see a distant religious authority. They saw someone who had suffered, survived, and found answers. And those answers were framed as both spiritual and practical. Faith, she taught, could improve not just your relationship with God, but your mindset, your confidence, your habits, and ultimately, your life. As her audience grew, so did her ministry's reach. Books, television programs, conferences, devotionals, and online platforms expanded her influence far beyond church walls. Her teaching style blended scripture with motivational language, creating something that felt less like traditional preaching and more like spiritual self-help. For many, this was refreshing. Religion felt accessible again. God felt close, supportive, and affirming. But as the ministry expanded, questions began to surface not about belief, but about scale. Joyce Meyer Ministries became a global operation, generating tens of millions of dollars annually. The organization defended its finances as necessary to support outreach, humanitarian work, and broadcasting costs. And it's true that the ministry funded charitable programs, disaster relief, and Bible distribution. Yet alongside this charitable image existed a level of personal wealth that unsettled many observers, especially longtime believers who remembered a simpler model of ministry. Reports revealed that Meyer lived in a multi-million-dollar home, traveled in private jets, and maintained a lifestyle far removed from the financial realities of much of her audience. For older supporters, many living on pensions or Social Security, this contrast raised uncomfortable questions. Donations often came from people who believed they were supporting spiritual teaching and outreach, not luxury. Meyer responded to criticism by emphasizing transparency reforms and stating that excesses from earlier years had been corrected. Her ministry implemented financial oversight boards and accountability measures. Unlike some figures who dismissed scrutiny entirely, Meyer acknowledged concerns which earned her respect from some critics. But acknowledgement did not erase the deeper issue. When does a ministry stop being about spreading faith and start functioning like a corporate brand? A key part of Meyer's teaching centered on prosperity, not always framed as guaranteed wealth, but as God's desire for believers to live blessed lives. While she often avoided the most extreme claims of instant riches, the underlying message remained consistent. Obedience, positive thinking, and generosity would lead to personal success. Giving was frequently presented not as sacrifice, but as a pathway to blessing. For an older audience, this message carried a quiet pressure. If life still felt hard, if finances were tight, if peace felt elusive, the implication lingered that something was missing: faith, mindset, or obedience. And once again, responsibility subtly shifted from the system to the individual believer. The ministry thrived. The message expanded. The burden remained personal. What made Joyce Meyer especially influential was her ability to normalize wealth within ministry. Unlike flamboyant televangelists of earlier decades, she presented success as evidence of God's favor earned through discipline and obedience. Her wealth was not displayed as extravagance, but as reward. This framing made it harder to question. To criticize her lifestyle felt to some like criticizing God's blessing. Yet the transformation of ministry into a brand was undeniable. Joyce Meyer was not just a preacher. She was a recognizable name, a publishing powerhouse, a global conference draw. Her message was consistent, marketable, and scalable. Faith became something that could be consumed through books, broadcasts, seminars, and merchandise. The spiritual life was no longer confined to prayer and community, but extended into products and platforms. For many supporters, especially older ones, this evolution felt confusing. They had grown up in churches where pastors lived modestly and congregations supported one another directly. The idea that spiritual teaching required massive revenues and executive-style leadership felt foreign. And yet, Meyer's calm demeanor, personal testimony, and emphasis on emotional healing made it difficult to dismiss her outright. This is what makes her chapter complex. Joyce Meyer did not rise through deception exposed on tape or scandal revealed overnight. She rose through adaptation. She represented a more polished, modern version of religious commercialization, one that wrapped prosperity in therapy, branding in encouragement, and wealth in testimony. The spectacle faded, but the business remained. For an older generation watching this transformation over decades, the question is not whether Joyce Meyer helped people. Many say she did. The question is whether the structure surrounding that help blurred the line between ministry and marketplace. When faith becomes a lifestyle brand, success becomes proof of righteousness, and giving becomes a tool for personal gain. Something fundamental shifts. This chapter is not about condemnation. It is about evolution. Joyce Meyer illustrates how faith-based influence adapted after earlier scandals, becoming smoother, more credible, and harder to challenge. And as this documentary continues, her story stands as a bridge between the crude excesses of early televangelism and the refined global religious enterprises that followed. Because when belief is packaged carefully enough, it no longer feels like it's being sold. And that may be the most powerful transformation of all. Chapter 3, Paula White. As televangelism evolved into the late 1990s and early 2000s, faith increasingly merged with politics, power, and public influence. Religion was no longer confined to church buildings or television studios. It began moving into the halls of government and the center of national identity. Few figures represent this shift more clearly than Paula. She rise did not begin with theological scholarship or denominational authority. It began with charisma. She was energetic, emotionally expressive, and deeply confident in her interpretation of Scripture. Her sermons were not built around careful biblical exposition, but around declarations, spoken with urgency and certainty. God, she taught, was not distant. God was active, responsive, and ready to intervene immediately in the lives of believers who aligned themselves correctly. White's message resonated strongly with audiences who felt overlooked or unheard, particularly those facing personal or financial struggle. She spoke the language of spiritual warfare, destiny, and divine favor. Life's challenges were framed as battles, and faith was presented as a weapon. Victory, she promised, was possible, but only through obedience, agreement, and commitment to God's chosen path. As her television presence expanded, so did the scale of her ministry. Donations flowed in, conferences multiplied, and her profile grew beyond religious broadcasting. Unlike earlier televangelists whose influence stayed largely within Christian media, White crossed into the political sphere. Her sermons began to include language about national destiny, leadership, and authority. Faith in her framework was no longer just personal, it was national. For older viewers who had grown up with a clear separation between religion and politics, this shift felt unfamiliar. White openly taught that God raises specific leaders for specific moments, and that believers were called to support them as an act of faith. Opposition was framed not simply as political disagreement, but as resistance to God's will. This approach transformed political loyalty into spiritual obedience. At the heart of Paula's theology was the idea of alignment. Blessing flowed, she claimed, when believers aligned themselves with the right words, the right actions, and the right leaders. Prayer was not merely conversation with God. It was a declaration that shaped reality. Giving money to the ministry was described not as support, but as participation in God's work. Financial contribution became spiritual agreement. This messaging carried a quiet but powerful implication. If blessing followed alignment, then lack of blessing implied misalignment. If success followed obedience, then struggle suggested spiritual failure. Once again, responsibility subtly shifted away from systems, institutions, and leaders, and onto the individual believer. Paula's personal life also became part of her public ministry. Multiple marriages, highly visible relationships, and luxury living drew criticism, particularly from older Christians who remembered stricter expectations for pastoral conduct. White addressed these concerns by emphasizing grace, forgiveness, and personal growth. Critics were accused of legalism or spiritual blindness. Supporters were encouraged to focus not on the messenger's imperfections, but on the power of the message. As scrutiny increased, so did the blending of faith with influence. White's proximity to political power elevated her visibility while shielding her from traditional religious accountability. She was no longer simply a pastor answerable to a congregation. She became a spiritual advisor operating at the highest levels of authority. That position made questioning her more difficult. Criticism could be reframed as hostility toward faith itself. For older believers watching from home, this created tension. They had been raised to see pastors as servants, not power brokers. To them, the image of religious leaders advising presidents, commanding loyalty, and living lavishly felt distant from the humility they associated with faith. And yet, the messaging was persuasive. National struggles were framed as spiritual crises. Political victories were described as divine triumphs. Faith became identity. Financially, White's ministry functioned like a modern enterprise. Donation appeals emphasized urgency. Special offerings were tied to spiritual breakthroughs. Conferences carried premium pricing. The language of sacrifice remained, but the structure resembled a brand more than a church. Faith was no longer something practiced quietly. It was something activated publicly and funded consistently. What distinguishes Paula in this documentary is not merely wealth or influence, but the normalization of power within ministry. She represented a stage where faith was no longer just sold as personal comfort or prosperity, but as access to authority, to destiny, to national significance. Belief was positioned as a force capable of shaping governments, economies, and history itself. For a generation that had lived through wars, social upheaval, and political disillusionment, this message could feel empowering. It offered meaning in chaos and clarity in complexity, but it also carried risk. When faith becomes inseparable from power, accountability weakens. Leaders become insulated. Questions become threats. This chapter is not about denying belief or mocking conviction. It is about recognizing a turning point. Paula marks the moment when religious branding extended beyond television and publishing into the realm of political influence. She illustrates how faith can be transformed from a source of humility into a symbol of authority, and how easily spiritual devotion can be redirected toward loyalty, money, and power. As this documentary continues, her story raises an increasingly urgent question. When religious leaders stand beside power instead of above it, who is faith truly serving, and who is paying the price? Chapter 4, T.D. Jakes. As religious media entered the new millennium, a different kind of preacher came to dominate the landscape. One who did not rely on scandal, overt miracle claims, or political proximity, but on scale, sophistication, and emotional mastery. Among the most influential of these figures was Jakes, a man whose reach extended far beyond the pulpit and whose ministry redefined what modern religious leadership could look like. Jakes did not rise by shocking audiences. He rose by understanding them. His sermons were theatrical, but controlled, deeply emotional, yet carefully structured. He spoke with authority, but also with empathy. He addressed pain, identity, trauma, family, and self-worth, subjects that resonated powerfully with people who had lived long enough to carry regrets, losses, and unanswered questions. For many older viewers, Jakes did not feel like a distant televangelist. He felt like a counselor, a motivator, and a spiritual guide rolled into one. Unlike earlier figures who centered their message almost entirely on money or miracles, Jakes focused on inner restoration. His sermons often emphasized healing from emotional wounds, reclaiming personal power, and stepping into one's purpose. God, in his teaching, was not just a savior of souls, but a restorer of broken lives. This framing allowed his message to reach audiences who might have been skeptical of overt prosperity preaching, but still longed for meaning and reassurance. As his influence expanded, so did the scale of his operation. The Potter's House, his Dallas-based megachurch, grew into a massive institution with tens of thousands of members. His sermons reached millions through television, books, films, and conferences. Jakes was not just preaching to a congregation, he was leading a global audience. His brand extended into publishing, cinema, music, and leadership seminars. Faith, under his guidance, became something that could be experienced across platforms and consumed in many forms. For older believers who remembered when pastors were primarily shepherds of small communities, this transformation was striking. Jakes operated less like a local minister and more like a chief executive. Decisions were strategic. Messaging was consistent. Presentation was polished. The church functioned not only as a place of worship, but as a hub of production, distribution, and influence. Financially, Jakes' success was undeniable. His books topped bestseller lists. His events filled arenas. His lifestyle reflected the rewards of that success. While he did not flaunt wealth in the same way as some prosperity preachers, his affluence was visible. This raised a quiet but persistent question for many long-time believers. When does success in ministry begin to resemble success in business? Jakes addressed criticism by reframing the conversation. Wealth, he suggested, was not inherently sinful if it was used responsibly and generated through legitimate means. His emphasis on discipline, leadership, and excellence resonated with audiences who valued hard work and achievement. In this framework, success was not exploitation, it was evidence of effectiveness. Growth meant reach. Reach meant impact. Yet embedded within this narrative was a subtle shift. Faith was no longer just about humility and service. It was about expansion, influence, and legacy. The language of ministry increasingly mirrored the language of corporate leadership. Congregants were encouraged to see themselves not only as believers, but as participants in a larger vision, one that required financial support, loyalty, and trust in centralized leadership. For many older followers, this created mixed feelings. On one hand, Jake spoke powerfully to real pain and offered encouragement that felt genuine. On the other hand, the scale of the operation made personal accountability feel distant. When leadership becomes this large, questioning it can feel futile or even disloyal. The emotional connection remained strong, but the relational closeness diminished. Another defining aspect of Jakes' ministry was his ability to navigate controversy without direct confrontation. When critics questioned his theology, his finances, or his influence, he rarely engaged publicly in conflict. Instead, he emphasized unity, love, and forward movement. This approach preserved his broad appeal. He avoided polarizing extremes and positioned himself as a bridge between traditional faith and modern culture. This adaptability was a strength, but also a shield. By remaining flexible in language and broad in appeal, Jakes minimized scrutiny while maximizing reach. His ministry could evolve with cultural trends without appearing unstable. For an audience that had lived through decades of religious change, this stability was reassuring. Yet it also meant that clear boundaries between ministry and enterprise, between spiritual authority and personal power, became harder to define. What makes Jakes significant in this documentary is not scandal or exposure, but normalization. He represents the moment when the megachurch model became fully legitimate in the eyes of mainstream culture. Faith-based empires no longer needed to defend their size. Size itself became proof of divine favor. Influence became validation. Reach became righteousness. For older believers watching this evolution, the experience was complex. Many felt genuinely helped by his teachings. Many found comfort and strength in his words, but others quietly wondered whether something essential had been lost. When faith becomes scalable, when sermons become products, and when spiritual leaders become brands, the relationship between shepherd and flock fundamentally changes. This chapter is not an accusation, it is an observation. Jakes illustrates how religion adapted to a world driven by media, metrics, and market logic. He shows how faith can remain emotionally powerful while becoming structurally corporate. And he raises a difficult question for anyone who has watched this transformation over a lifetime. Can a ministry grow without becoming something else entirely? As we move forward in this documentary, the pattern continues. Each figure refines what came before. The spectacle fades, the language softens, the systems grow stronger, and with each evolution, faith moves one step further from the quiet spaces where many first encountered it, and deeper into the machinery of influence. Chapter 5. Joseph Prince. As global Christianity moved deeper into the digital age, a new form of religious messaging gained momentum, one that was smoother, more optimistic, and far less confrontational than the fire and brimstone preaching many older believers remembered. Fear receded, judgment softened. In its place came reassurance, positivity, and the promise of ease. Few figures embodied this transition more clearly than Joseph. Joseph emerged from Singapore, far from the traditional centers of American televangelism, yet his influence quickly became international. His sermons were polished, articulate, and carefully framed. He spoke calmly, often smiling, rarely raising his voice. God, in Prince's teaching, was not angry or demanding. God was generous, loving, and eager to bless. Sin, while acknowledged, was treated as something already resolved through grace. What mattered most was understanding that grace correctly. This message appealed strongly to many older believers who had grown weary of guilt-driven religion. After decades of sermons focused on sin, failure, and moral struggle, Prince's teaching felt liberating. He emphasized rest over striving, belief over effort, and receiving over sacrificing. Faith, he taught, was not about discipline or endurance, but about accepting what God had already done. For those carrying long-term burdens, regrets, disappointments, unresolved pain, this approach offered relief. As Prince's ministry expanded, his church grew into a megachurch with tens of thousands of attendees, and his broadcasts reached millions worldwide. Books, television programs, and online sermons carried his message into living rooms across continents. His teaching style was consistent, accessible, and emotionally soothing. Scripture was often framed through personal anecdotes and practical encouragement rather than rigorous theological debate. This made his message easy to absorb and easy to share. Yet beneath this comforting surface lay a subtle transformation of faith. Prince's emphasis on grace was frequently paired with promises of tangible benefits. Favor, health, success, and financial provision were described as natural outcomes of believing correctly. While he avoided the most explicit claims of guaranteed wealth, the implication was clear. Understanding grace properly would lead to a better life. Struggle, therefore, was not a mystery. It was a misunderstanding. For older viewers, this carried a quiet tension. Many had lived faithfully for decades, endured hardship, loss, and sacrifice, and still faced illness or financial insecurity. To hear that blessings flowed automatically from correct belief raised uncomfortable questions. If life remained difficult, was faith somehow incomplete? Had grace been misunderstood? Once again, responsibility subtly shifted inward. Financially, Prince's ministry reflected the success of his message. His books became bestsellers. His church operated on a massive scale. His lifestyle, while less flamboyant than some Western televangelists, reflected significant wealth. Supporters were encouraged to give generously, often framed as responding to grace rather than earning favor. Giving was described not as obligation, but as gratitude, a natural response to blessing. This framing made financial appeals harder to challenge. To question them risked appearing ungrateful or resistant to grace. For older believers raised to see giving as a duty rather than a transaction, this shift felt unfamiliar. Money was no longer tied to sacrifice. It was tied to participation in abundance. Faith became less about endurance and more about alignment with blessing. Another defining feature of Joseph's ministry was his emphasis on personal revelation. He frequently positioned his teachings as corrective, offering insights that traditional churches had misunderstood or neglected. This created a sense of exclusivity. Followers felt they had access to a deeper understanding, a clearer message, a more accurate gospel. While empowering, this mindset also discouraged external critique. Disagreement could be dismissed as ignorance of grace. As Prince's influence grew, critics raised concerns that his teachings minimized accountability and moral responsibility. They argued that emphasizing grace without balance risked turning faith into entitlement. Prince responded by insisting that true grace naturally produces good behavior and that focusing on rules only leads to failure. This debate highlighted a broader shift within modern Christianity, the move from discipline toward comfort, from transformation toward reassurance. For many older believers watching this evolution, the contrast was striking. They remembered sermons that emphasized perseverance through suffering, humility in scarcity, and obedience without expectation of reward. Prince's message, by comparison, felt gentle, but also transactional in its own way. Blessing was no longer earned through sacrifice, but expected through belief. What makes Joseph significant in this documentary is not scandal or controversy, but tone. He represents a stage where faith became emotionally therapeutic and spiritually convenient. The harsh edges of religion were smoothed away. The demands softened, and in doing so, belief became easier to accept and easier to market. This chapter is not about denying the comfort his message provides. Many genuinely find peace in it. It is about recognizing a shift, When faith promises rest without struggle, blessing without sacrifice, and success without endurance, it begins to resemble something familiar, not religion as many once knew it, but a product designed to soothe and reassure. As this documentary continues, Joseph stands as a reminder that faith does not need spectacle or scandal to become a brand. Sometimes it only needs to promise comfort and ask for trust in return. Chapter 6, David Oyedepo. As Christianity expanded rapidly across parts of Africa in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, faith took on a new public role. Churches were no longer only places of worship. They became symbols of aspiration, national pride, and economic promise. In this environment, religious leadership often carried the weight of social hope. Few figures illustrate this transformation more clearly than David. David rose to prominence in Nigeria during a period of intense economic uncertainty. For many ordinary people, life was marked by unemployment, inflation, and limited opportunity. Traditional institutions felt distant or ineffective. In that vacuum, faith became more than spiritual refuge. It became a pathway to survival. Oyedepo's message spoke directly to this reality. He preached dominion, victory, and prosperity, presenting Christianity not as a faith of endurance, but as a system for overcoming poverty and limitation. His sermons emphasized covenant. According to this framework, God had entered into binding agreements with believers. If those agreements were honored through obedience, loyalty, and giving, prosperity was not optional. It was guaranteed. Poverty, therefore, was not merely misfortune. It was evidence of broken covenant. This teaching resonated deeply with people who longed for control over lives shaped by forces beyond their reach. As his influence grew, Oyedepo founded what would become one of the largest church networks in the world. Massive auditoriums were constructed, capable of holding tens of thousands of worshipers at a time. Services were grand, highly organized, and emotionally charged. Success stories were central. Testimonies of financial breakthroughs, promotions, and business growth reinforced the core message: faith works, and prosperity is proof. For older observers, both within Africa and abroad, the scale was astonishing. Many had grown up associating churches with modest buildings and humble clergy. Oyedepo's ministry, by contrast, projected power. Private universities, publishing houses, real estate holdings, and media operations became part of the religious ecosystem. The church did not simply operate within society. It stood above it as a parallel institution. Central to Oyedepo's teaching was the principle of giving, particularly tithing and sacrificial offerings. Giving was framed not as generosity, but as obligation. To withhold was to violate covenant. To give faithfully was to activate divine laws. This approach placed intense pressure on believers, especially the poor. In congregations filled with people struggling to meet basic needs, offerings were still demanded as proof of faith. Supporters argued that this system empowered people by teaching discipline, hope, and responsibility. Critics countered that it placed the burden of systemic failure on individuals. If prosperity did not come, the explanation was not economic reality or social injustice, but insufficient faith. Once again, responsibility flowed downward, never upward. Oyedepo's personal wealth became a focal point of controversy. He was widely reported to own private jets and to live in luxury far beyond the means of most followers. Defenders viewed this wealth as evidence that his teachings were true. His success was not seen as exploitation, but as demonstration. God had blessed him, therefore his message must be correct. To question his wealth was to question the promises of God. For older believers, this logic felt unsettling. They had been raised to associate holiness with humility and leadership with restraint. The image of pastors as billionaires challenged long-held assumptions about spiritual authority. Yet the messaging was powerful. Wealth was no longer something to be cautious about. It was something to claim. Another defining aspect of Oyedepo's ministry was hierarchy. Authority flowed from the top down. His words carried exceptional weight, often presented as direct revelation rather than interpretation. Disagreement was discouraged, sometimes framed as rebellion against God's order. This structure created unity and efficiency, but also reduced accountability. When leadership becomes unquestionable, correction becomes nearly impossible. For many followers, however, the ministry provided structure, community, and hope. In regions where government systems failed to deliver opportunity, the church offered education, networking, and a sense of belonging. This complexity makes Oyedepo's story difficult to reduce to simple terms. His ministry both filled gaps and reinforced dependency. It inspired ambition while demanding submission. What makes David essential to this documentary is scale and intensity. He represents a version of faith where prosperity is not a possibility, but a requirement, where spiritual success is measured visibly, and where religion becomes deeply intertwined with economic aspiration. Faith becomes a strategy for advancement, and the church becomes a vehicle for upward mobility. For older viewers watching this global expansion of prosperity theology, the contrast with earlier forms of Christianity is stark. The quiet virtues of patience, suffering, and modesty feel overshadowed by language of conquest, ownership, and abundance. Religion no longer prepares people for hardship. It promises escape from it. This chapter is not about dismissing the hope Oyedepo offers, nor denying the social impact of his institutions. It is about recognizing how faith adapts to desperation. When belief is framed as a contract with guaranteed returns, it becomes difficult to separate spiritual devotion from financial expectation. As this documentary moves forward, David's story raises a critical question that echoes beyond borders and cultures. When faith becomes the primary explanation for wealth and poverty alike, who is truly being served and who is being asked to pay the price? Chapter 7, Chris Oyakhilome. As global Christianity continued its rapid expansion through television, satellite broadcasting, and the internet, a new kind of religious authority emerged, one rooted not only in preaching, but in claimed revelation. In this environment, charisma was no longer enough. Influence now depended on the assertion of direct access to divine knowledge. Few figures embody this shift more distinctly than Chris. Chris rose to prominence by presenting himself not simply as a pastor, but as a teacher of higher spiritual understanding. His sermons emphasized insight, revelation, and what he described as hidden truths, available only to those who listened correctly. God in his teaching was not mysterious or distant. God was precise, instructional, and constantly communicating. Oyakhilome positioned himself as an interpreter of that communication, translating divine intention into practical guidance for everyday life. This approach appealed strongly to audiences seeking certainty in a confusing world. For older believers who had lived through decades of social, political, and technological change, Oyakhilome's message offered clarity. He spoke with authority and confidence, often presenting his interpretations as settled fact rather than opinion. Questions were unnecessary, he implied, because revelation had already provided the answers. As his ministry expanded, Oyakhilome founded Christ Embassy, a global church network with branches across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Services were polished, energetic, and highly structured. Worship blended music, affirmation, and teaching into an immersive experience. Faith was presented not as struggle, but as mastery. Believers were encouraged to see themselves as spiritually elevated, distinct from the rest of the world. Central to Oyakhilome's teaching was the concept of confession. Words, he taught, had power. Speaking correctly could shape reality. Illness, poverty, and hardship were often framed as consequences of incorrect thinking or negative speech. Healing and prosperity, by contrast, were outcomes of proper belief and declaration. This placed immense responsibility on the individual believer. Circumstances were no longer external challenges. They were reflections of internal alignment. For older viewers, this framework carried both appeal and pressure. On one hand, it offered control. After a lifetime of enduring forces beyond their influence, economic shifts, health decline, social change, the idea that words and belief could restore agency was comforting. On the other hand, it quietly removed space for vulnerability. Admitting struggle risked signaling spiritual failure. Doubt became not a human experience, but a flaw. Financial giving played a significant role within Oyakhilome's ministry. Contributions were framed as partnership rather than obligation. Supporters were told they were participating in a global mission. advancing God's work through their generosity. Giving was associated with increase, protection, and favor. As with other prosperity-oriented movements, the connection between faith and financial contribution was subtle but persistent. Oyakhilomei's personal wealth and lifestyle became subjects of scrutiny over time. Reports of luxury, private travel, and expansive assets contrasted sharply with the economic realities of many followers. Supporters defended this disparity as evidence of divine blessing. His success was presented not as separation from the people, but as inspiration for them. He was living proof, they argued, of what faith could produce. Criticism, when it arose, was often dismissed as misunderstanding or hostility toward truth. Oyakhilome frequently warned against listening to external voices, urging followers to trust spiritual authority over secular opinion. This reinforced loyalty and insulated the ministry from scrutiny. Once again, accountability flowed inward rather than upward. Another defining feature of Oyakhilomei's influence was his public commentary on global events. He did not limit himself to spiritual matters, but frequently offered interpretations of world affairs, health crises, and political developments through a religious lens. These interpretations were delivered with certainty, framed as insight rather than speculation. For followers, this reinforced the sense that their faith provided privileged understanding of reality itself. For older audiences, this blending of faith and interpretation could be both reassuring and troubling. Many had grown up distinguishing between religious belief and worldly knowledge. Oyakhilomei's approach blurred that boundary. Faith was no longer just a source of comfort or moral guidance. It became a lens through which all information was filtered. Trust in spiritual authority replaced trust in institutions, experts, or shared consensus. What makes Chris significant in this documentary is not merely his wealth or reach, but the elevation of spiritual authority beyond challenge. He represents a form of faith where questioning is reframed as ignorance, doubt as misalignment, and disagreement as opposition to truth. In such an environment, belief becomes not a journey, but a conclusion. For many followers, the ministry provided confidence, identity, and a sense of belonging in a rapidly changing world. It offered answers where uncertainty felt unbearable, but it also narrowed the space for humility and shared humanity. When faith promises certainty in all things, it leaves little room for mystery, struggle, or growth. This chapter is not about denying the sincerity of belief or dismissing the comfort Oyakhilome provides to millions. It is about recognizing how authority evolves when faith becomes centralized around revelation rather than reflection. When spiritual leaders present themselves as the primary source of truth, the relationship between leader and follower shifts dramatically. As this documentary continues, Chris's story underscores a recurring pattern. The spectacle may fade, the tone may soften, and the language may become more refined, but the structure remains. Faith becomes a system, authority becomes absolute, and belief, once personal and communal, becomes something mediated, filtered through those who claim to know more, see more, and speak for God more clearly than anyone else. And that raises a question older generations are uniquely equipped to ask, having witnessed decades of change. When faith no longer tolerates doubt, who benefits from certainty, and who is silenced by it? Chapter 8. Pat Robertson. For many Americans who came of age during the Cold War, religion was not just a personal matter. It was cultural, national, and deeply intertwined with ideas about morality, responsibility, and the future of the country. In that landscape, few religious figures became as recognizable or as influential as Pat. Pat did not begin his public life as a firebrand preacher. He presented himself as composed, educated, and measured, speaking with the tone of a broadcaster rather than a revivalist. When he founded the Christian Broadcasting Network, or CBN, his vision was ambitious but clear: to use television as a tool to bring Christian values into American homes on a daily basis. For many older viewers, CBN became a familiar presence, a steady voice offering prayer, news, and commentary in a rapidly changing world. Unlike many televangelists who focused almost exclusively on miracles or prosperity, Robertson positioned himself as a moral guide for the nation. His flagship program blended religious teaching with current events, presenting news through a distinctly Christian lens. For viewers who felt alienated by mainstream media, this approach was comforting. It affirmed their values and reassured them that faith still had a place in public life. Over time, however, Robertson's influence expanded beyond broadcasting into direct political engagement. He did not merely comment on politics, he sought to shape it. He spoke openly about elections, legislation, and public policy, framing them as spiritual battles rather than civic debates. Political outcomes were described in terms of divine approval or judgment. Leaders were praised or condemned not only for their actions, but for their perceived alignment with God's will. For an older generation raised on the idea that church and state occupied separate spheres, this blending felt significant. Robertson argued that separation did not mean silence, and that faith had a responsibility to guide governance. Supporters saw this as courage. Critics saw it as overreach. But regardless of perspective, the result was undeniable. Religious belief became a political identity. Financially, Robertson's ministry grew into a powerful institution. CBN generated substantial revenue through donations, media production, and affiliated ventures. Supporters were encouraged to give not simply to sustain programming, but to support a broader mission, one that included humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and international outreach. These efforts were genuine and visible, particularly through organizations linked to CBN that provided medical assistance and emergency support worldwide. At the same time, Robertson's personal wealth and institutional power raised questions. He lived comfortably, far removed from the financial realities of many supporters. Defenders argued that managing a global media organization required resources and expertise. Critics countered that the line between ministry and enterprise had blurred. As with other figures in this documentary, success itself became justification. One of the most controversial aspects of Robertson's public life was his commentary on tragedy and disaster. He frequently interpreted natural events, social crises, and personal suffering as signs of divine judgment. For some viewers, these statements reinforced a sense of moral order in a chaotic world. For others, especially those who had lived through loss and hardship, they felt harsh and unsettling. Suffering was no longer something to be mourned, it was something to be explained. For older audiences, this framing carried emotional weight. Many had experienced wars, economic downturns, and personal tragedy. To hear such events attributed to moral failure, often of groups rather than individuals, could deepen fear rather than offer comfort. Faith, instead of easing anxiety, sometimes intensified it. Yet Robertson's appeal endured because he spoke with conviction. In an age of uncertainty, certainty itself became persuasive. He did not hesitate. He did not equivocate. He offered answers when others offered complexity. For viewers tired of ambiguity, this clarity was reassuring. It provided a framework through which the world made sense. As his influence peaked, Robertson's role evolved from preacher to power broker. He ran for political office, advised leaders, and positioned himself as a spokesperson for a broad segment of conservative Christianity. His faith was no longer just personal testimony, it was institutional force. Donations supported not only broadcasting, but ideology. Belief translated into action, and action into influence. What makes Pat essential to this documentary is not a single scandal or doctrine, but the normalization of religious authority in political life. He demonstrated how faith could be leveraged to mobilize voters, shape narratives, and sustain long-term influence. He showed that religion, when aligned with media and power, could move beyond the pulpit and into the foundations of public discourse. For many older believers, Robertson represented both reassurance and unease. He defended values they recognized, spoke a language they understood, and stood firm against cultural change. Yet he also transformed faith into something confrontational, something that divided as much as it unified. Religion became a line drawn in the sand. This chapter is not about dismissing the sincerity of Robertson's beliefs or the real humanitarian work associated with his ministry. It is about recognizing how faith can shift when it becomes inseparable from power, when belief aligns itself with authority, criticism becomes opposition, and disagreement becomes spiritual defiance. As this documentary moves forward, Pat's story marks a turning point. Faith is no longer only sold as hope or healing. It is sold as influence. And when belief becomes a tool for shaping nations rather than nurturing souls, the cost is often paid quietly by those who trusted religion to comfort them, not mobilize them. And that leaves one final question echoing forward. When faith becomes a political force, who decides whose God is speaking and who is expected to listen? Chapter 9, Kenneth Copeland. For many Americans who lived through the rise of televangelism from its earliest days, one face became impossible to ignore. It appeared again and again on television screens, speaking with confidence, intensity, and an unmistakable sense of authority. That face belonged to Kenneth, a preacher whose influence helped define what prosperity theology would ultimately become. Kenneth's message was direct and uncompromising. Faith, he taught, was not passive belief or quiet trust. Faith was a force. Words were tools. Reality itself could be shaped by what believers spoke aloud. According to Copeland, God had established spiritual laws as fixed as gravity, and those who understood and applied them correctly could claim health, wealth, and success as their rightful inheritance. For older viewers, this message was both fascinating and unsettling. Many had been raised on a form of Christianity that emphasized humility, endurance, and acceptance of life's hardships. Copeland's teaching flipped that model upside down. Suffering was no longer something to endure, it was something to reject. Illness was not a trial, it was an enemy. Poverty was not a condition, it was a spiritual failure. Copeland's preaching style reinforced this worldview. He spoke forcefully, often raising his voice, repeating phrases, and declaring outcomes with absolute certainty. There was no room for doubt in his theology. Doubt was not just human weakness, it was a spiritual liability. To question the promise was to cancel it. To hesitate was to invite failure. As his ministry grew, Copeland became a central figure in the Word of Faith movement, a network of churches and broadcasters that shared similar teachings about confession, prosperity, and divine entitlement. His television programs reached millions. His conferences filled large venues. His books and teachings circulated widely, especially among audiences seeking answers to illness, debt, and fear. Central to Copeland's message was the act of giving. Financial contributions were framed as sowing seeds into spiritual law. Give generously, he taught, and God was obligated by his own promises to return that gift multiplied. This was not presented as metaphor, but as mechanism. Faith activated results. Money activated faith. For older believers living on limited incomes, this teaching carried emotional weight. Many gave sacrificially, believing they were participating in a divine system that would eventually rescue them from hardship. When the promised returns did not come, the explanation was never systemic or theological. It was personal. Faith had been insufficient. Words had been wrong. Belief had wavered. Over time, Copeland's personal wealth became a focal point of public attention. He was reported to own multiple private jets and live in significant luxury. When questioned, Copeland defended these assets as necessary tools for ministry, insisting that commercial travel exposed him to spiritual contamination and that private aircraft allowed him to serve God more effectively. To supporters, this explanation reinforced his authority. To critics, it exemplified excess justified by belief. For older viewers, these defenses often felt disconnected from lived reality. Many had spent decades working, sacrificing, and saving modestly. The idea that spiritual purity required private jets clashed with long-held values of restraint and humility. Yet Copeland's confidence left little room for challenge. His authority rested not on consensus, but on conviction. Another defining feature of Copeland's ministry was his approach to illness and death. He frequently taught that sickness resulted from flawed belief, and that healing was always available through correct faith. This doctrine placed enormous pressure on believers facing serious health conditions. To acknowledge fear or uncertainty risked undermining one's healing. Acceptance of medical realities could be interpreted as spiritual failure. For older audiences, many of whom had lived long enough to experience chronic illness and loss, this message was particularly heavy. It offered hope, but at a cost. When healing did not occur, grief became complicated by guilt. Loss became intertwined with self-blame. Faith, meant to comfort, sometimes deepened pain. Copeland's influence extended beyond individual believers into the structure of modern religious broadcasting. He demonstrated that prosperity preaching could sustain itself indefinitely if framed as spiritual law rather than promise. When blessings failed to materialize, the system remained intact because responsibility never left the believer. The message could not fail. Only people could. What makes Kenneth essential to this documentary is not simply wealth or controversy, but endurance. His ministry persisted through decades of criticism without meaningful change in structure or message. He helped normalize a version of Christianity in which faith was measured by results, authority was unquestionable, and material success was proof of spiritual alignment. For many older believers watching this evolution over time, the transformation was profound. Faith had moved from the realm of mystery into the realm of mechanics. God became not just a source of comfort, but a system to be operated. Prayer became declaration. Giving became leverage. Belief became currency. This chapter is not about denying the sincerity of those who follow Copeland or the hope they seek. It is about examining what happens when certainty replaces compassion and success replaces humility. When faith becomes a formula, those who fail the formula are left carrying the weight alone. As this documentary nears its conclusion, Kenneth stands as a symbol of a faith transformed into infrastructure, rigid, self-reinforcing, and resistant to accountability. And his story prepares us for the final chapter, where prosperity preaching sheds its intensity and adopts a gentler face, while the system itself remains firmly in place. Chapter 10, Joel Osteen. By the time the 21st century fully arrived, the face of televised Christianity had softened. The sharp edges of prosperity preaching were rounded. The language of spiritual warfare faded. In its place came reassurance, optimism, and emotional safety. Faith no longer needed to sound forceful to be powerful. It only needed to feel comforting. No one embodied this transformation more completely than Joel. Joel did not rise as a traditional preacher. He did not thunder from the pulpit or dwell on sin, judgment, or doctrine. His sermons were short, encouraging, and carefully worded. He spoke about hope, positivity, gratitude, and self-belief. God, in Osteen's message, was not a disciplinarian or a judge, but a supporter, someone who wanted believers to live confident, successful, and fulfilled lives. For many older viewers, especially those tired of fear-based religion, this tone was immediately appealing. Osteen's rise was also tied to familiarity. He inherited leadership of Lakewood Church after the death of his father, stepping into a role already supported by infrastructure and audience. But rather than maintaining the style of earlier megachurch preaching, he shifted direction. Scripture became inspiration. Sermons became motivational talks framed by faith. Theology faded into the background, replaced by affirmation. As Lakewood Church grew, so did Osteen's reach. His services filled a former sports arena. His broadcasts reached millions worldwide. His books topped bestseller lists. His public image became carefully managed, approachable, smiling, reassuring. He avoided controversy whenever possible, rarely commenting on divisive social or political issues. Faith, under Osteen's leadership, became a refuge from conflict rather than a framework for confronting it. For older believers, this approach carried mixed emotions. Many appreciated the relief. After decades of sermons warning about moral decline, punishment, and sacrifice, Osteen's message felt gentle. It offered peace in a world that seemed increasingly loud and hostile, but others felt something essential was missing. The calls to humility, repentance, and service that had once defined faith were noticeably absent. Financially, Osteen's ministry reflected immense success. While he famously stated that he did not take a salary from the church, his wealth came through book sales, speaking engagements, and related ventures. To supporters, this distinction mattered. To critics, it felt like a technicality. Either way, the result was the same. Faith had become extraordinarily profitable. Osteen's message reframed prosperity in subtle ways. He rarely promised wealth outright. Instead, he spoke of favor, opportunity, and increase. Life's difficulties were described as temporary setbacks on the way to blessing. If one maintained the right attitude, spoke positive words, and trusted God, better days were always ahead. Struggle was not denied, but it was never allowed to define the believer. For an older audience that had lived through wars, recessions, illness, and loss, this optimism could feel comforting or unrealistic. Many had learned that life does not always improve, that suffering can linger, and that faith sometimes coexists with unanswered prayers. Osteen's refusal to dwell on these realities created a kind of emotional distance. Pain was acknowledged briefly, then gently moved past. Another defining feature of Osteen's ministry was his avoidance of theological specificity. He rarely addressed controversial doctrines or moral questions. This broadness allowed his message to reach across denominations and even beyond Christianity. Faith became universalized, almost abstract. God was present, benevolent, and supportive, but largely undefined. Belief became more about mindset than conviction. This approach made Osteen one of the most widely accepted religious figures in modern America. He was rarely accused of extremism. He did not provoke outrage. He did not demand loyalty beyond attendance and attention. And yet, this very neutrality raised concerns among longtime believers. When faith avoids difficult truths to remain accessible, what is lost in the process? Critics argued that Osteen's message placed responsibility squarely on the individual. If life improved, it was proof of faith. If it did not, the implication, however gently phrased, was internal. Mindset needed adjustment. Words needed correction. Hope needed reinforcement. Structural injustice, systemic inequality, and random tragedy rarely entered the conversation. For older viewers, this could feel isolating. Many had endured hardships that optimism alone could not solve. They had learned resilience through acceptance, community, and shared burden. Osteen's emphasis on personal positivity sometimes felt disconnected from those lived realities. Faith became private, internal, and largely disengaged from collective struggle. What makes Jolie significant in this documentary is not scandal or aggression, but culmination. He represents the final evolution of faith as brand. The message no longer needs urgency, fear, or spectacle. It simply needs to be pleasant. Belief becomes a product that reassures without challenging, comforts without confronting, and inspires without demanding. For a generation that has watched faith evolve over decades, from local churches to televised empires, from humble pastors to global brands, Osteen's success raises a quiet but profound question. When religion becomes indistinguishable from motivation, when sermons resemble self-help, and when belief asks nothing but optimism, what remains of its original purpose? This final chapter is not about denying the comfort Osteen provides to millions. Comfort has value. Hope matters, but it is about recognizing how far faith has traveled from its roots. What began as a source of meaning in suffering has become, for many, a promise of relief from discomfort itself. As this documentary closes, the stories told across these chapters converge into a single reflection. Faith did not disappear. It adapted, it scaled, it branded itself, and along the way, it learned how to survive scrutiny, absorb criticism, and continue growing. The question left for viewers, especially those who have lived long enough to remember a different relationship with belief, is not whether faith should exist, but what it should demand, what it should offer, and who it ultimately serves. Because when God becomes a brand, belief becomes a transaction, and transactions, no matter how comforting, always come at a cost.